Greetings, urban farmers, gardeners, and healthy food visionaries. Farmer Greg here, and welcome to the 408th episode of the Urban Farm Podcast, where every day we work together to educate and inspire you to become part of your food revolution. Did you know the best seeds for your garden don't come from the nursery? In fact, the seeds that will create the most robust and delicious fruits and vegetables come directly from your garden. This is because they are uniquely adapted to your growing conditions, better than anything you can buy from a fancy catalog or website. Through the magic of seed saving, it is quite possible to have the garden of your dreams. The best part is, saving your own seeds is surprisingly easy and fun. With a bit of instruction, anyone can become a seed-saving superstar. Let us teach you how in our free seed-saving webinar. Just text SEEDS to 33444 to sign up, or visit seedsavinghacked.org for more information. That's SEEDS to 33444, or visit seedsavinghacked.org. Today on our podcast, we have someone who prefers the taste of fresh pressed oil. We're talking with Ron Mantini about homemade olive oil. Ron was born and raised in Lorain, Ohio, 30 miles west of Cleveland on the shores of Lake Erie. He moved to Chandler, Arizona in 2000 after graduating from Ohio State University to work for Intel Corporation. With several olive trees in his backyard, Ron decided to experiment and taught himself how to make his own olive oil from scratch. Welcome to the show today, Ron. Are you ready to rock olive oil?
I am ready. Let's go.
Excellent. So I shared a bit about you. Can you fill in the blanks for us and share more about the path you took to get where you're at today?
Sure. So yeah, as you mentioned, I moved out to Phoenix for work after college. And when I bought the current house I live in 2004, lo and behold, I inherited 3 very large olive trees. I do have an Italian background. My father's 100% Italian, so I'm half Italian. I'm also Polish and Slovak from my mom's side, but I do like Italian food. I've always made, homemade pasta and homemade sauces, and, the idea of being able to make olive oil intrigued me immediately. And if you drive around Phoenix and know what an olive tree looks like, they're everywhere.
Oh, yes.
And in my neighborhood, especially, I have an older neighborhood. Homes were built in the 70s, so there's a lot of very tall ones, and my neighbors had them. So I started asking around, what do you guys do with all these olives? Because, they are loaded, much like other fruit trees. Some years very heavy, other years less, depending on how you prune them.
I'll bet they looked at you funny, right?
Yeah, it really, no one does anything with them that I could find, and they typically just make a mess. They fall, the birds eat them, you end up with some bird droppings in different colors depending on how ripe the olives are. So it's a big mess, and no one really did anything. So I started researching, and I really couldn't find anyone that tried to make olive oil out of them. A lot of people, there are some examples of you can cure your own olives and jar them like you'd find in a store. That's also one of the first things everyone does is you see an olive tree and you pick an olive and you bite into it and it tastes terrible. You have to brine them and cure them if you want them to get to the edible stage. So that's where my journey began on, digging in. What can I do with these? I'd say a few years later, I met you, Greg. I was actually out at the urban farm. I'd taken a different job at Intel where I had what we'd call like a fireman schedule. I had a shift job where I was working 12-hour days, and that led to, you only work 3 days one week, 4 the next. So I had a lot of free time, and that's really when I got into gardening. I read a big interview from Bill Mollison, who I know you're familiar with.
Oh, yes.
And that turned me on to what permaculture was. So I did a quick Google on Phoenix permaculture, and that's how I found you. So out to the urban farm I went, and I learned about having fruit trees, and I started growing tomatoes at that time and composting. So I've got 3 big, compost bins in my backyard that I got from the city of Chandler. They'll give you those for free. Anyone who's listening to Chandler, if you just call them up, they take the old garbage cans and cut them in half, and you can use those. I started getting into that kind of stuff. I learned how to bake bread. I learned how to make, I mentioned homemade pasta.
Wow.
Growing tomatoes. And I had this, I guess the initial thing I wanted to do was I had been growing tomatoes a few years. And I grew onions and I grew garlic. I'm like, wouldn't it be neat if I made like a batch of homemade sauce with stuff totally from my yard? And the missing ingredient was olive oil.
Yeah, that's always a cool thought.
Yeah.
And that's where I've struggled in the past is I can do most everything except the oils. So go.
Right. At this point, I have to give a tip of the hat to the Queen Creek Olive Mill. It started off as a hobby for the guy, Mr. Ray, that that founded it. Just, I think he wanted to just, also Italian, wanted to make olive oil, and it just took off. Some of the local chefs started, tasting their oils and couldn't get enough of it. And every year they've gotten bigger and better. It used to just be buy your oil. Now you can have pizza and gelato and coffee, and they have concerts, and it's fantastic. So anyway, if you go back at this point, 10, 12 years ago, somewhere on the internet, I found that you could bring them olives and they would press them and give you half of the output for free. So it's really a great thing they do. Community pressing. They do ask that you bring quite a bit of olives. So this is where we can kind of get into maybe why olive oil is expensive and whatnot. It takes a lot of olives to make olive oil. So
it takes a lot of olives to make olive oil.
Yeah. To give you a couple rough ideas, I think back then they would tell you don't really bring them to us unless you have 125 pounds. That's usually 4 or 5 5-gallon buckets filled with olives. That would usually make around a gallon, and then they would give you half of that. I did that one year. I rounded up a bunch. It's a lot of work to pick that many olives, by the way, too, if you don't have.
Right.
Out at the olive mill there, they're doing this specifically to make olive oil. So they prune the trees to keep them a certain height, and they have different methods that are better than what I have. In my yard, the olive trees were mostly for shade. So in most of the neighborhoods, that's what they've done. Olive trees need very little water. So around Phoenix, they're huge. So to get to those olives that are way up in the tree, not so easy. And that's kind of the difficult part for me, is gathering them. So anyway, I took them.
Hold on. Let me stop you. So
okay.
120 pounds of olives is going to make a gallon of oil.
You got it. Yep.
And each olive is about 2 grams? Half an ounce?
I don't think I've weighed them at that level, but a 5-gallon bucket, just picture if you have a pool, anyone that buys a 5-gallon bucket of chlorine tabs, if you fill that with olives, that's about 25 to 30 pounds, depending on, how what type of olive it is. So yeah, that's an idea as to why like olive oil is not cheap.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is where I discovered what fresh olive oil tastes like. Now, I didn't have any idea. I just wanted to make olive oil out of my olives. And so I brought them, my first haul, and a couple weeks later, they called me back to pick up my gallon or half gallon, whatever it was. I think maybe I brought them enough to get 2 gallons out of it. And they give it to me, and I was shocked. So it's bright green, and I'm looking at this clear 1 gallon tube. I'm like, what is this? It didn't look, in a grocery store, your olive oil is typically like golden hued with some clarity. This was bright green. You couldn't see through it. And I tasted it, and initially I was like, whoa, this is not olive oil. So I guess the first reaction when you first taste fresh olive oil is a little bit of shock, and then I was instantly addicted. It went from, what is this, to I can't get enough of it. It's very strong. It's very peppery. People describe it as grassy. And to understand olive oil, it's the opposite of wine. As it ages, it loses its flavor. So it basically, when it comes out of the chute, day one, it's got the most flavor it's going to have. And every day you lose a little bit. And that is why if you go shopping in the grocery store, and it's, if you don't know anything about olive oil, and you would see imported from Italy, imported from Spain, Greece, whatever, you would think, oh, that must be really good. Well, the reality is that olive oil is probably quite old by the time it gets to a shelf in a grocery store in the valley. And, try to seek out, if I could recommend something to our listeners here, if you can find a local oil. California has quite a few. I've mentioned Queen Creek if you're in Phoenix, and they ship everywhere. You're going to get a much better product if you get something more local. Anyway, that was my first taste of fresh olive oil, and I couldn't get enough of it.
And it's I'm looking at a picture of it right here. It is bright green.
Yeah, and that is the Italians call that olio nuovo, which means new oil. And there's festivals I've read about in Italy when you have that first pressing. They always save a lot of the oil for the whole year, but there will be like a festival or a party to celebrate the new oil and really enjoy that fresh flavor when it first comes out. And that got me hooked on it. So I did that for a few years where I would bring them my olives, but a couple, I started getting greedy. I said, I don't want to give, even though they were doing this for free and it's a wonderful program, and they're, the quality of what they do with their machinery is impossible to beat.
Yeah. I
said, maybe I could keep the whole batch myself if I can figure out how to do this at home. That was quite a challenge. It took several years to come up with anything that worked, but I'd be happy to share some of those details.
Yeah. So is there 3 steps to it?
Yes. And this was the challenge at home. So in order to make olive oil, you don't just squish olives and get oil. There's 3 phases you mentioned. You need to, and this first step was the most challenging for me. You have to crush the olives. And really what made me think I could do this is, this has been going on for thousands of years, right? You can find references to, olive oil being made in Spain and Italy and wherever, 6000 BC, I think you can, they've been doing this forever. And it used to just be done with large stones that they would turn over the olives, and, maybe a mule or a donkey was pulling it in a circle. And so you've seen those pictures. You're like, all right, with modern stuff, I should be able to tackle this. So of course, I was all over the internet looking, and there are some companies that sell homemade mills, but they're very expensive. If you want to buy like a hobbyist mill, I saw them as much as $5,000, and I think
Right.
that was more than I paid for the car I was driving at the time.
Yeah, exactly.
So like, there's got to be another way to do this. So how can I, squash these olives? That's step one. If you can get that accomplished, step two is you have to do a process it's called malaxation, and it's really mixing the olives because you get a mash after you squash them. The malaxation process basically allows like the tiny droplets of oil to adhere to each other, and you get bigger pools of oil. And if you don't do this step, you get nothing. Like you can't skip it. So you do have to malax the olives. I do it for typically 45 minutes. I mean, some of these commercial operations may be different, big bins, but you have to do that step.
So what is that? So Liz, before we travel on, the first step is getting them crushed. How are you getting them crushed?
So I, for many years, couldn't solve this. I didn't have a good way. So my first effort, and I did make olive oil, was I filled my food processor with olives I picked, and I, whirred them around and beat them up as bad as I could.
Uh-huh.
And I did the malaxation stage just in a KitchenAid mixer. And then I stuck the mash into a cheesecloth and put it in, like if you've made pasta with a stainless steel pot that has a colander, you can insert inside of it. I stuck it in there, and I just put some weights on it and let it sit for 20 minutes. And I did get some oil out of that. So I'm like, all right, we can do this, but the amount that filled up a food processor is tiny. The yield was tiny. So I had to figure out how can I do this on a bigger stage. And that wasn't like a great process. That would have destroyed the food processor blade in short order because of the pits.
Right.
And so I started experimenting, like, can I even at one, I mean, this is crazy, you're going to laugh, but I was just trying to see what could, is there some machinery out there? I was looking into like industrial equipment. What can break these up? So I was looking at attachments you could put on a weed eater.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I bought a 55-gallon food grade bucket from a restaurant that probably had soda or something in it, and I put a bunch of olives in there, and I was trying to just find some way to, to crush a bunch of olives. Now the big mills, they have something called a hammer mill that does this very efficiently. It's very expensive.
Oh yes.
The old ways were with the giant stones. That didn't seem very realistic to get a giant stone wheel in my backyard. So this, eventually, and I can't remember what year this was. It was probably 3 or 4 years into trying this. I found someone in Australia, and I think another person in New Zealand. Olive trees grow out there, and they were using a garbage disposal. And this was like the light bulb moment for me.
Oh.
A garbage disposal does a perfect job of destroying these olives into a perfect mash. So where I'm at today is I have, and I'll kind of get back to how I thought I should be able to do this for a lot less than $4,000 or $5,000 with some of these hobbyist mills we're doing. I just went and got a countertop from Lowe's that someone had dinged up, like a scratch and dent one that was pre-cut. Yep. I found a sink on Craigslist or something, a 2-sided sink, which is perfect, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then I bought a 1 horsepower, pretty heavy duty garbage disposal off Amazon. And it's only used for that. It's not like it's my house. It's garbage disposal. It's dedicated for the olive oil.
Yep.
So I pull it out once a year and clean it and get back to work. So I set up a temporary sink, if you will, in my backyard about this time of year. And I got a food grade 5-gallon bucket, and I stick that under the garbage disposal. And on the 2-sided sink, the left side, because the olives are always dirty and you got to pick out some of the leaves and stems. So I clean them on one side, and then I put them through the garbage disposal on the other, and that solved the problem of how to crush these things. And it does it in pretty short order.
That solves step 1.
Yes. So now,
okay, good.
The other 2 seemed less daunting, and they were. So now I have to stir them. And my solution here was that same 5-gallon food grade bucket that I bought at one of the local stores that sells grains around here. I got a mud mixer, which you'd call, it's basically a giant stir paint or to stir drywall compound. So I bought one of those, and I kind of I put a lid on my 5-gallon bucket when it's filled, and I stick that in, and I cut a hole in the top of the lid to put the mixer down into it, just a small hole for the drilling piece or the mixing piece. And I set it up. It has like the one I have has a hold setting, so I kind of set up a couple concrete blocks on top of it and just let it spin in there for like 45 minutes. So that's my malaxation period. And at this point, I have something I can press. And at Harbor Freight, I found a shop press that I think people use to work on ball bearings and brakes. Maybe. You'll find a whole bunch of videos of this exact press on YouTube of people making apple cider and apple juice. And so that's how I came up with that idea. So I basically, at the end, I get back to that stainless steel colander I mentioned earlier. I do layers of my olive mash in cheesecloth, and I press it, and out comes the yield. It's still, at this point, there's one last step that's much less. It's decanting, basically, because olive and oil and water don't mix, and olives are still About 80% water. I'd say like the oil content in,
Oh, wow.
in olives is like 10 to 20% oil.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the flesh parts and the pit and the rest is water. So when you press it, you're getting mostly water, but the oil rises right to the top. And I just basically use some fat separators you might use for soup or whatever to, that's where it sits. I pour out the water, and then I have that bright green oil that you saw in the picture I sent you.
Wow. And we'll have that picture on our show notes page for the show. That is quite the epic process. My listeners know that I'm always looking for epic, and this is quite epic. Good job. Virtual high five to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Wow. So how long have you had that process in place to where you actually can get a harvest?
I think I'm probably on 4 or 5 years of that now. It is really a labor of love. This is not something I'm doing or have any vision of doing for commercial purposes. I love the fresh oil. It's a great hobby. From start to finish, I usually do it one 5-gallon bucket at a time. If I have a good yield, I can get around 2 ounces of oil from that. And that will still take me probably 3 or 4 hours of work, not counting the olives, to do that. So it is a labor.
Yeah, 2 ounces out of
no,
a
32 ounces.
Oh, 32 ounces out of a 5-gallon bucket.
Yes.
All right. Well, yeah.
And there's a lot of variables. Certain, I pick them all over. I live in Chandler, the South Tempe area. There's trees lining a lot of the streets they're kind of behind people's backyards, and when I'm picking them, some of the people that live there come and say thank you, because again, they just fall usually and make a mess.
And make a mess.
So I get a lot of different varieties. One of the things, when you're doing this, you kind of want to mix. So that bright green oil you saw comes from a less ripened olive. If you let olives ripen, they turn to that dark purple or black state. And you want a balance, because the more ripe, the more oil, the less ripe, the more flavor. So you look for, I've seen people say 40, 60, 50, 50. You want that balance where you get a nice yield out of your batch, but you want some of the green ones in there to give you that extra kick.
Yeah.
That is so special with the fresh oil.
Wow.
So certain oils certain olives are oilier. I have a mission tree, and those are very oily. You get a very good yield out of those. I have a manzanilla tree. I get less out of those. And there's a bunch of other varieties that I'll be honest with you, I don't know all the varieties. There's quite a few, and I'm picking them off all these trees in town. I don't know which ones they are half the time. So when I mix those all together, sometimes I can get 44 ounces out of a 5-gallon bucket, sometimes 28. If I get 32, I'm happy. So, 4 batches to make 1 gallon. I usually make about 2 or 3 gallons per fall, and it's a good Christmas present for all my relatives. I give them little bottles, and it's great fun.
How cool is that? So how do you go about picking the olives? Because each olive is the size of no bigger than a quarter. And do you have to harvest them off the tree?
Yes. So you don't want to pick them off the ground. So if they've already fallen, leave those alone. This is my least favorite part of the operation. So, you can, so in my backyard, for example, I can't put down like sheets or nets and just knock them out with a rake. That's easy. However, to get the volume like I'm talking about, I don't always have hundreds of pounds on my 3 trees. So I have to go out and get them off the streets, like I've mentioned. And, down near Ocotillo is actually a great place. I don't know North Phoenix as well. I'm sure there's
all over the place.
Yeah, all over the place. So I'm usually picking these on the side of the road in a ladder. So it's slow. I do, because if you just knock them out of the tree, you have to do a lot of cleanup. So it's like, phase 1 is knock them out into these nets, and then you got to pick out all the leaves and sticks that you.
Yeah.
So when I do them out of a tree directly, I'll just basically get on a ladder with a bucket and some gloves on and just kind of scrape them off by hand. Because sometimes I'm like literally on a sidewalk 5 feet away from a street, and I can't put sheets down. I don't have the room.
Right.
So I'll just but if you find a really when an olive tree has a heavy set, you can fill up a 5-gallon bucket pretty quickly if you're lucky. They're not always easy to find, but you can get lucky, and I do once in a while.
Yeah. Well, that's part of the wild crafting of it, going out and finding these. And then once you identify that olive tree, you want to go back to it.
Right. Yeah, I do have some, regulars that I've hit for several years in a row. And like I've said, this with all your fruit trees, that you get heavier sets certain years than others. So some years they're great and other years there's less.
Do you ever share oil with the people you're harvesting from?
I do. Yeah, for sure. In my neighborhood, my neighbors have quite a few olive trees. So I'll give them like a fresh loaf of bread and some of my oil when I'm done pressing it if they let me pick their olives.
Nice.
So
what's the reaction?
Oh, I mean, they're shocked because some of my neighbors, again, like I said, this neighborhood was built in the 70s, and some of them are original owners of these homes that had these trees forever and never did anything with them. So they were shocked that you could do this when I first started doing it. And I think, very excited now that when I bring them back to little the result of my labors.
Yeah. Nice. Wow. Well, as I shared with you before we started, in over 400 episodes, we've never talked with anybody about olive oil. So good job.
Thanks. Yeah, it was definitely, as I mentioned, it was hard to track down anyone even trying this. So, the power of the internet, I found this person in Australia and another one in New Zealand they were further ahead on the curve than I was, and
yeah,
some tips and ideas, and here we are.
I actually have an apple crusher and apple press. Have you looked at those as possibilities?
I haven't, I've looked at old, would this be like a cast iron one?
Yeah. Heavy duty.
I have I have wondered if those would work. I actually have an active Craigslist search in Phoenix for whenever a cider press goes up for sale. I take a quick look at it. It probably could, it depends how mashed up it gets, because you really want them into if they're just crushed, that's not quite as good as if they're really just, when I'm putting them through the garbage disposal, they come out in liquid form almost. I mean, everything, including the pit, is really pureed, if you will. So they might work, they might not.
Yeah.
I've actually thought the cider press might be a good option for step 3 when you're pressing it.
Right. Yeah, so, exactly.
I will try that someday if I get my hands on it. I tried a smaller, like a wood-sided one where you would put it's used for winemaking as well.
Yep.
And that kind of works. It's just my other press, I'm able to put more force down on it. I think like a 12-pound shop press. So I really when I'm done, I have like essentially mulch left over from the mash, and I throw that into my garden.
Cool. Can we get some pictures of what your equipment looks like?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I did share some videos. I can send them to you again. I have
perfect.
They're very crude. They're not not very well commented or anything, and they're from 3 or 4 years ago. Me and my kids doing this, where I showed steps 1, 2, and 3 of all this happening, and they're on YouTube.
Yeah.
So I'd be happy to share those links with you again, and you can see the
perfect.
The all 3 stages there.
Yeah, I've got them. We'll put them on the show notes page. So I'm going to shift on you, and I'd like for you to talk about a time you failed, how you overcame that failure, and what you learned from it.
Great. Well, I've got so many examples in those years before I figured this out of failing. I have a great one though, which is after we had this aha moment and I figured out to use the garbage disposal and and actually get a good yield of oil. I had a weekend where I made them, like I mentioned, I think I got like a 44 or 48 ounce yield out of one of those buckets. And I said, finally, I've cracked it. I know what I'm doing. And I picked a bunch more olives that day. And I think either that next Monday or Tuesday before work, I had this idea of, I'll just get up before work 5 a.m. and do another batch. So I did that, got up, did all my steps. Step 2 didn't seem like it was, usually you can see the oil coagulating when it's happening. It didn't look right. And time was on, clock was running late. I had to get to work. So I went and pressed it and I got nothing. So I went from, a whole bucket that gave me 44 ounces of oil to another bucket, same trees. They gave me absolutely 0. And I was just dumbfounded. What the heck happened?
Yeah.
Did everything the same. And how did I get nothing? Well, back to the internet and back to researching and, and kind of what I do at Intel, I'm a database administrator. I'm constantly troubleshooting problems. So it's like, all right, let's break this down. What are what could have went wrong? The problem with, if you're working on a computer and you run a test and it fails, you can just submit it again 5 minutes later, getting to the point of pressing oil, which takes 5 or 6 hours of lead time.
Right.
It wasn't such a great, not too easy to reproduce. But here's where I ran into the concept of temperature. And you will always see on olive oil bottles, first cold press, right? I'm sure you've seen cold pressed, first cold press, something like that on a bottle of oil you bought at a store.
Yes.
And there's a little bit of that might be misleading. And even today, so in the old days, you always pressed it. The modern mills and what they have in Queen Creek, they use a centrifuge and they spin it to separate the water and oil and the mash. So they still might label these as first cold press, but they're not even pressed anymore. Most of them are spun. But I was pressing. And when I researched on the internet, cold pressing, you're allowed to call it cold pressed up to like 83 degrees. So I guess it's very standard for everyone to heat their mash up to that point. So you still, even though you're saying it's cold pressed, you do warm it up if in fact it's not warm enough. Well, what was the difference between when I did this on Sunday and, Tuesday at 5 a.m? I think it was 90 degrees on Sunday and it was 55 degrees on Tuesday at 5 a.m. when I tried. So that was it. I didn't, the mash wasn't warm at all and I didn't get any oil out of it. And so from that point on, I started when I clean them in that I mentioned I have a 2-sided sink. So when I clean them, I kind of soak them in some warm water if it's not warm outside already, because I'm doing this in my backyard. So I'm totally, whatever the temperature is outside, that's what the temperature of the olives are going to be, unless I, need to warm them up a little. So that was it. And the next time I made sure, if I wasn't in the afternoon, if I was doing this at a cooler time of day, that I warmed them up first, and that did solve the problem.
Now, were you able to go back and warm that other batch up?
No, it was a total waste, a total failure. Yeah, at that point, when you get through pressing it, nothing's coming out. It's done. So that was but I learned. So
right.
Good example for your question there.
Well, and this is exactly how we figured this stuff out. You just go do it and see what happens.
Keep doing it. Yep. Keep at it.
Yeah. So what do you consider your biggest success?
Yeah, my biggest success would have to be my family. I have 4 kids and a wonderful wife. So we have a family of 6 here, and it's wild to keep up with everything that we have going on between the ages of 8 and 13. Mm-hmm. So school and sports and everything else that goes with that. Plus, we both work full time. So the fact that everyone's happy and healthy, that's easily my biggest success.
Nice. And you get to feed them well.
Yeah. And they're all into this stuff too. So they are some of my big helpers. If you watch those videos, they're a little smaller because they're from 3-4 years ago, but they help me. And, my kids know how to roll out homemade pasta. It's pretty amazing. They learn at a young age. I can give them a lump of dough and they can turn it into noodles for you.
That is amazing.
Yep.
That's amazing. When I was in high school, I had a peach tree that I had planted when I was a freshman. And by the time I was a senior, it was making peaches. And I said to my buddy, I wish I knew how to can peaches. And he says, my mom will teach you. So I learned how to can peaches from Tim's mom, which I still know how to do that to this day. So having those skills taught to you when you're this age is beautiful.
Yeah, and having it be normal. It's not even like a special thing if you do it enough. So it's almost like they expect, to do things that way, which is great.
Yeah, exactly. So what drives you?
I'm gonna have to say the family again. When you go from a point where you're just taking care of yourself to taking care of you and your wife, and now you got 4 other kids to, I'm responsible for taking care of all of them. So they definitely drive me to, in everything we do, right, to provide for them and save for their future and just raise them right. And
yeah,
they're my drive. That's for sure.
Yeah. Beautiful. So if you could recommend one book for our listeners, what would it be and why?
This is a tough one. I don't read as many books as I'd like to. This one will have nothing to do with gardening, but I'll throw it out there anyway. I'm a sports fan, and it's the most recent one I read. It's called The Sports Gene, and it's written by a guy named David Epstein. This really isn't, again, it's no relationship here, but I just finished reading it, and I loved it. As a guy that has been a lifelong follower and participant in sports, it was just a fascinating read on, diving into, if you're interested in sports, like why do certain countries produce great sprinters but not great long distance runners, and why do other countries do the exact opposite? And kind of breaking down the human physiology into certain, some of us are born with a certain type of fast twitch muscles and slow twitch muscles. Just a fascinating read.
Wow.
And I just recently finished it, so it's fresh in my mind when you asked me this.
Cool.
I am 6'8". I don't know if you remember that. So I was a basketball player, and it has a lot of details on, basketball players and sprinters, and just I couldn't put it down. So that's the most recent book I read. And
excellent.
If you're a sports fan, it all dive in.
Are your kids tall too?
Yeah, my oldest daughter is in 8th grade, and she's pushing 6 foot. She's 5'11", so she's gotten her height from me.
Nice.
And the other ones are tracking that direction as well.
Nice. So what one final piece of advice do you have for our listeners?
I would just say follow your passions. And, with the internet, the world has become such a smaller place, that if I look at what I was trying to tackle here, and if you rewound the clock 20 years, I probably would have been in the library, and maybe I'd have found something, maybe I wouldn't have. But to be able to just search the internet and find someone's website in Australia and click on an email and send them an email and have this person talking to me, and it really solved the problem. It's just amazing. So if you have a passion, it seems, with the internet and the availability of information at your fingertips, you should be able to pursue almost anything.
Yeah.
So go for it.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely different. I'm 57 years old. And so I've lived a big chunk of my life without the internet. And, back 35, 40 years ago, when I was raising fish in my backyard, we went to the library and we did, research in books on how to do this. And so you're right. It is a different game these days.
And the library is still a great place. I love popping in to research something, but the speed and the amount of time you might have to spend versus what you can do on the internet, it's a big difference.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show today, Ron. This has been an inspirational chat.
Well, I'm very happy to be on it. You were one of my inspirations, Greg, years ago. As I mentioned, I didn't know you could grow apple trees in Phoenix until I saw your anti-apple and golden Dorsets there in your backyard. So I really appreciate you having me on, and it's been good talking to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So how can our listeners get a hold of you?
Sure. If you my email address is r_Mantini, which is MANTINI at yahoo.com. You can find me on Twitter. Ron_Mantini is my handle. If there's anyone in the Phoenix area that like I said, there's olive trees everywhere, and my least favorite part is picking them. So if there's any listener to this podcast that would be interested in seeing how this works and they wanted to bring me a bucket of olives, I could show you how it works and we could split the proceeds. So if you're interested in that, reach out and maybe we can make that happen.
Excellent. That would be fun to do. That is for sure. You can also find show notes from today's podcast at urbanfarm.org/Ron's Fresh Pressed Oil. We are your urban farming resource. You can find our podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and iHeartRadio. Also visit urbanfarm.org to find articles, podcasts, webinars, courses, and more. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on the Urban Farm Podcast.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.